Here kind of emerged from some discussions faculty had last year about the threats and kind of thinking about conservation and new conservation ideas to take some labs into and so on. And one of the things that came up in the discussions was thinking about the human side of things and how humans respond to the environment and interact with it and kind of the feedback between the environment and humans. And so I thought that we have Dan Stokols is one of the leaders in the field thinking about the interaction between humans and environment just down the road. And he's basically, so his field is environmental psychology or social ecology, which is basically the study of the interplay between the environment and people, whether it's the natural environment, the built environment, or the social environment. And so it seemed like maybe we could learn a little bit from this new field that I actually had no idea existed until I bumped into Dan at a conference and talked a little bit about nest architecture of Bay ants, and he introduced me to a colleague who was thinking about team science, and I learned about that field. And so I think we have a lot to learn from Dan, who's really a leader in this field and one of the main researchers in it. He's now Professor Emeritus in the Department of Planning, Policy, and Design and the Department of Psychology and Social Behavior at the School of Social Ecology in UC Irvine. He got his bachelor's at the University of Chicago in psychology, and then his master's and PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in social psychology. And then he's been at UCI since 1973, so quite a while, and has held various leadership roles, including the director of the program in social ecology. And he has received many awards for his career achievements, for his mentorship, for several teaching awards, and various Professor of the Year from students and so on. And he's been a scientific consultant for many societies and so on, including the National Academies of Science Keck Foundation, which is how I met him. And so, without further ado, I'll...
Thank you, Noah. Appreciate it. Yeah, we met at the National Academies Keck Foundation conference and had some really interesting discussions, and Noah and her collaborations with others have really borne a lot of fruit since that first meeting. How many of you have heard the term human and social ecology, those terms? Okay, so it's not completely. I did a book this year called Social Ecology in the Digital Age, and I'm going to be talking about some of the ideas. Human and social ecology certainly are rooted in biological ecology. But there's some different takes on things than a purely bioecology approach, so I'm going to talk about that. When I was in high school, this is my school newspaper, they did some articles about graduating seniors, and I was doing this science program for a year. I'd leave after school to go to a laboratory of this man, Professor Howard Lenhoff, who was a leading scholar in the developmental biology of coelenterids, hydra, sea anemones. So I got a chance to work on a year-long project with him. I thought I was going to become a marine biologist. I was isolating the substance in brine shrimp that elicit the feeding response in sea anemones. It turned out to be glutathione, but in those days we had to do it with paper chromatography, and so I learned a lot of those interesting ideas. And then I went off to the University of Chicago, as Noah mentioned, and I got exposed to their interdisciplinary general education program. I was taking courses in anthropology, sociology, urban planning, and I took a course co-taught by a social psychologist and a Marxist sociologist. And it was called social psychology, but it was a really interesting course because it brought those perspectives together. So I decided I wanted to go into social psychology, so I went to Chapel Hill and joined this department, but I also had this hankering for a broader view of environment and behavior relationships, not just at the personal level or the small group level, but the societal, the community, the natural environment, the physical. So I found my way to some other departments. I took minors in city planning, sociology, and public health. And then that led me to the program in social ecology when it was starting in the early 70s. I was recruited in 73. It started in 1970. The campus only opened in 1965, so it was a very untested idea. My advisors in social psychology were a little bit surprised and not so enthusiastic that I was going here. They wanted me to go to a psychology department, which I almost did, but I came out for this job interview and I kind of got hooked on this whole interdisciplinary approach. So we've seen this grow from a little itty-bitty program that was kind of marginalized on the campus to a full-fledged school. And I think one of the reasons it became a school in 1992 is that it was quite unique in the UC system And when we started in '70, we were talking about, training students to analyze research and societal questions from an ecological perspective, a multi-system, multi-scale kind of view of phenomena over time, an interdisciplinary approach, and a translational approach where you link research and theory to actual problem solving and policy. And back in the '70s, that was sort of heresy. That was not how you build academic departments. Today, it's coin of the realm. You got to be interdisciplinary, translational, transdisciplinary. So I've had a chance at UCI to study a number of things. I have studied environmental psychology. I've studied ecological approaches to health and health promotion. I've studied the science of team science, the circumstances that enable interdisciplinary teams to work well or not. One of the things we do when our students come in addition to introducing them to tenets of interdisciplinarity and translational science and the like, we try to introduce them to principles of biology, bioecology, which originated with the work of Ernst Haeckel in 1866. He first used this term ecology, the interrelations between organisms and their environments. And he was studying biomes, how plant and animal species interact with each other in these geographically bounded areas. But some of that work lacked a kind of theoretical thrust. How do they adapt over time, these species, and how do they evolve? And of course, Darwin and Wallace were writing around the same time, and when their books came out, especially Origin of Species, Descent of Man, that provided a lot of heft to biological ecology. It acquired a lot more stature, driven by those theoretical ideas. Human ecology was adopted by a group of sociologists at the University of Chicago. They're called the Chicago School of Human Ecology, where they got the idea of applying these principles of adaptation to a biome, and yet the biome was the city, the human city, and in their case, the city of Chicago. So they did a lot of analyses showing the spatial distribution and the gradients of disorder, behavioral problems, health problems across that spatial area in Chicago. And as you go away from the loop, this happens to be some of their data on juvenile delinquency, and you can't see the numbers well, but they kind of fall off, not too surprisingly, as you get to the more affluent areas. So they called this the concentric zone model of human ecology. It was kind of simplistic. It was sort of social Darwinism, because they took these principles of surviving in the rough and tough city, the mechanism for adaptation in the city was the economic system. And so if a company moved into, let's say, an inner city area and built a factory that spewed out smoke and made people sick, that was just an unaccounted externality. Nobody had to account for that. They had no ideas about environmental justice, about regulations and things like that. So social ecology turns out to give a little more emphasis on psychological, institutional, legal, cultural context of people-environment relations than earlier human ecological research. And people now are actually impacting their environment. It's not just the environment affecting them, they're actually impacting not just their regional environments, but the Earth system. I'll say a little bit about that too. When we try to introduce our students to ecological reasoning and the notion that phenomena are embedded in different contextual scales, one example is in the health area. So there's a biomedical paradigm of understanding health, right? And genomic factors that affect health status or disease outcomes, physiological processes, the germ theory, and then there's the biopsychosocial model, and then what I will describe as the social ecological model of human well-being. So as one example of the biomedical model, you've got this germ theory that Pasteur and Lister came up with. A host gets exposed to a pathogen and they get sick. It's kind of a linear process in some ways. My colleague at Carnegie Mellon, Sheldon Cohen, who's been a big proponent of the biopsychosocial model of disease, did this study where he confined students to a dormitory building after classes were over, paid them a couple hundred each to have cold viruses squirted in their noses. And yeah, it was hard work, but a lot of people volunteered. And he gave these students a scale he had developed called the perceived stress scale. In the past 4 weeks of your life, how overwhelmed have you felt by events? How depressed have you felt? Have you had hassles with a significant other, etc.? And he codified the participants in the study at the outset. This was a prospective study. He knew what their stress levels were. He squirted the viruses in their noses, and then he saw what happens. The high stress group typically got the cold. The low stress group, though, either didn't get the cold or they got much milder symptoms. So there was this moderation by psychological stress, a construct that the biomedical model wouldn't necessarily pull in. And so this is a kind of contextual thinking. Okay, you can have exposure to a pathogen, but what's the socio-psychological context in which that occurs? And there are a lot of ways in which ecological factors in our environment, both social and physical, affect people's well-being. So we all are coping with these environmental demands every day, especially from our digital devices. We're processing huge numbers of texts and emails and all kinds of social media. And one of the things this does is we have to work hard to focus our attention when we're working on something, not being distracted by all these outside influences. There's a colleague of mine, Gloria Mark at UCI, who studies white-collar office teams, and she finds that on average, members of these teams, work teams, are interrupted about 14 times a day by digital kinds of events and messaging. So when you're trying to tune out these distractions, even though you're fielding them at the same time, you can get mental fatigue, you can get psychological fatigue. And in this field of environmental psychology, one of the fields that I've worked in, that field studies largely at the behavior setting level, like in classrooms, homes, work settings, healthcare settings. What are the transactions between these physical and social circumstances and people's well-being? And one of the very interesting, so we study things like crowding and traffic congestion and noise. I've done research on airport noise, Los Angeles Airport, on kids that go to school under the flight path. But one of the very interesting areas of this field is on nature and how people respond to the natural environment. And there have been a number of books. One of the most important ones, that book, The Experience of Nature by Stephen and Rachel Kaplan, came out in 1989. Biophilic Design, which takes off from E.O. Wilson's idea of biophilia. And the idea is that nature has this restorative capacity to alleviate stress, to kind of recharge our batteries. One theory goes that when you participate a lot in focused attention and you're riveted on studying for an exam or getting a paper out, that causes mental fatigue, and that's called voluntary attention. Then you need to engage in what he called spontaneous or involuntary attention, where you go out and you see a flock of geese and you're sort of fascinated by that. Your attention is drawn to it spontaneously. You don't have to work to focus your attention. And James claimed that spontaneous attention is sort of an antidote to this focused attention fatigue. So they call that attention restoration theory. And their theory of restorative environments is that they provide these opportunities for fascination and spontaneous attention, the sense of getting away, like taking a vacation from your usual routines, being connected to cycles that are larger than yourself. So you're sitting on a mountaintop and you're feeling connected to these broad natural cycles and reflecting on that. And a balance between serenity and mystery. You don't want too much excitement and mystery in a wilderness environment, with a lion jumping out at you, but you want just enough to make it kind of different than your normal routine. So, these would be examples of soft fascination. Clouds, sunsets, scenery. They're not so powerful that they grab all your attention. Like if you're in a fire or you're in an earthquake, those are pretty fascinating, but those engulf everything. You can't think of anything else. But these kind of fascination experiences, you can get into a more reflective mode in terms of where you are situated relative to the rest of the world. Getting away, this is Harbor Boulevard in Orange County. And one of the things people like about vacations is they get away from those usual demands and stressors that they encounter. So some research examples of how this might work. This is a study by Roger Ulrich, and he tracked gallbladder surgery patients in a hospital in Pennsylvania, and he kept track of whether they were assigned to rooms that had views of nature or views of a brick wall, And what he found is that the patients in the tree view rooms had shorter postoperative stays. They checked out of the hospital earlier. They took weaker pain medication, and they had fewer negative write-ups by nursing staff. So this is an example of one of those outcomes, pain medication. And you can see by days 2 through 5 that the tree group is requesting less strong medication here compared to the wall group, and more weak doses of that pain medication. And the trends sort of continue over here. This was not a randomized controlled study. It was a retrospective study where they went back and they looked at patient records, but it was so provocative that Science magazine published it. And this kicked off a lot of other research on, whether indoor nature as well as outdoor nature might have these restorative effects. Some other examples, my colleague Gary Evans and Nancy Wells at Cornell University were looking at the experience of stress in young children, about 7 to 10 years old. And they wanted to know how the nature in their homes and the views they have of nature outside their homes might affect their distress levels. So they administered a measure of stressful life events geared for children, like are you being bullied, are you getting along with your teacher, a number of things that were relevant to kids, and they codified these kids in terms of high or low life stress. And they also they developed measures of how much greenery and nature was actually inside their homes and what kind of views they had. And they found some very interesting things. In particular, as you look at the kids with very high levels of life stress, that's where the buffering effect of nature is most pronounced. That's where you see this difference in psychological distress with the high nature kids significantly lower than the kids that have little nature. When kids are not having distress, you don't see that differential as much. So it's kind of provocative that nature, especially in stressful situations, may have this kind of buffering effect. Another very interesting set of studies by Francis Kuo at the University of Illinois has looked at low-income housing projects and finds that for people living in apartments that have a view of trees, and these are very poor populations, but at least they have some greenery outside, what they find is that those people report better mood, less indoor family violence, domestic violence, and improved coping, lower crime rates, whereas these kind of apartments where you don't have the benefit of those nature views, more negative mood, more violence, impaired coping, crime rates. So this has been replicated in a number of different studies, a very interesting application of restorative environments to a low-income housing situation. And there are many examples of gardening programs that have been seen to cause a number of positive outcomes, such as greater social capital among the people that get involved in managing those gardens during the summer, reduce violence adjacent to the buildings, things like that. So there are a number of guidelines now that many companies are incorporating, and they're not necessarily waiting for all the research to come in. They're providing employees with restorative spaces at work, or with a lot of access to nature where they're working, or meditation environments where employees can go in and tune out for a little bit from the workday. So it has some practical applications. There's also research suggesting that people have a very strong inclination to want to be in a windowed workspace. And when you don't have those windows, that connection to the outside, it's not so good for people. And this is from Chris Alexander, who is a very well-known urban design scholar at Berkeley. And when you look at occupants in windowless offices compared to windowed offices, in these windowless offices, you find that people put up much more visual materials, decorations, and more nature-oriented decorations, more landscape. So here you've got a little artificial window with the curtains and everything, with a nice poster behind it, where people have given themselves a view of nature because they're just kind of craving that. So this work on nature is really quite interesting. There, of course, when you talk about the social ecology of health and health promotion, there are other facets of our macro environment that are very important. How many fast food restaurants you have adjacent to a community or in a community is very much correlated with the community population obesity rates and diabetes rates. This is the In-N-Out Burger across from our UCI campus. People spend a lot of time in these lines waiting for fast food. But that's one aspect of the environment that affects health. An ecological view of health would also take into account whether people are living in or adjacent to low or undesirable land uses, like being near power stations, environmental injustice, which is more of a social factor in terms of people who have low income being disproportionately exposed to stressors and toxins in our communities. This used to be a big concern in the Obama administration. It's kind of gone away in the current administration. The director of the environmental justice wing of the EPA quit. He couldn't work there because basically those concerns are not very prominent anymore. But when you think of all the things that can affect our health, and I've showed you some examples of nearby nature and urban kinds of arrangements. This is a diagram from a paper by Glass, McAtee, in Social Science and Medicine, and it's a very broad, sort of encompassing genomic fact. These are under the skin. These are within the person under this horizontal arrow. And as you go up, you get outside the person in the environment. So this is sort of encapsulating from genomic to cellular to physiological, the micro environments that we participate in every day, the national scale, the global level, climate change. One of the things that's really crucial in training interdisciplinary scholars is enabling people to work from the genomic level to the microbiome to the environmental macrobiome of our environment. So this room has a bacterial profile, to what's called the exposome. That's all the environmental influences that we're exposed to on a daily basis or some period of our life. They call it the exposome. So why would anyone want to be that broad? And can anyone really master all those fields? No. But one of the things that's crucial for interdisciplinary scholarship is that people have to have at least enough openness to other perspectives to be able to link up with those to compensate for their own blind spots. So you can talk about urban sprawl. One of the things we know about urban sprawl is it's very much correlated with obesity and diabetes. And there have been studies of that where you have a low jobs housing balance. That is, people are spending a lot of time commuting every day between home and work. This is Mexico City. But the interesting thing about Alzheimer's disease, obesity, diabetes, but Alzheimer's disease, there's clear indications that exposure to fine particulate matter 2.5 is predictive of preclinical disease markers for Alzheimer's. So they've done autopsies on 11-month-olds to 40-year-olds, finding neurofibrillary tangles, amyloid plaques, different kinds of markers of pre-Alzheimer's. And yet, when you look at the interaction between that levels of cumulative exposure to fine particulates and their allele, their genomic proclivity, whether they have this APOE4 allele, that interaction brings their risk for those clinical markers up about 24 times. So more and more research is really starting to grapple with these macro exposome factors as they interact with the genome. All right, I'm going to step back a little bit now. I've been talking about how we're affected by our environments and especially nature in terms of our more local, immediate surroundings. But if you look at what's going on more broadly in terms of how society relates to nature, and this would be a kind of Yuval Harari perspective, that he lays out in *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*, there have been these transitions in our species where about 12,000 years ago we started to settle down from a nomadic to more an agrarian lifestyle. And only since the late 1700s, with the discovery of the steam engine, did we start the Industrial Revolution. And then the digital revolution, maybe since 1980 to present, that the cybersphere has really mushroomed. So that's become a whole new arena of people's environments that affects their well-being. And I want to talk about how these different parts of our environments, as an ecologist, the natural environment, the built environment, the sociocultural, and the cyber, or the virtual environment, how do those work together to affect our well-being? And it's these two here that have really put us in the ballpark of the Anthropocene, which is where humans are starting to truly change the Earth system. And by changing that Earth system, we're talking about major impacts of nature on our well-being. So I want to look at that broader view. When this book came out by Rachel Carson, it was a wake-up call that our use of pesticides and synthetic materials were getting into our agricultural systems and making us sick. But this study, done by some colleagues of mine at UCI, brought that level of environmental impact to the Earth system level. This was a study of ozone depletion, stratospheric ozone depletion, done by Sherwood Rowland and Mario Molina. And when Sherry stepped down as chair of the chemistry department at UCI, he decided to go to a weather conference where he met Jim Lovelock, a British researcher, who told him about the pooling of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, in the polar areas. And you know, Rowland was a nuclear chemist. He wasn't thinking about meteorology or CFCs, but he recruited Molina, who was a postdoc, to come to his lab, and they started doing these studies, and they published this really important paper. And actually there's a typo. This is in Nature, and there's actually a typo. It should say chlorine atom catalyzed. But they found that because CFCs are so inert, and CFCs are things like, they're used in propellants and aerosols, they're used as refrigerants, they're used as cleaners, cleaning agents in industry, and they're very inert chemically. So they can stick around for 150 years, these molecules, and they waft up to the stratosphere, from the troposphere to the stratosphere, and when they get hit by ultraviolet light, the chlorine atoms start to peel off and bond with ozone molecules. Ozone are the atomic structure O3, so you get a chlorine atom bonding with that, you get chlorine oxide and oxygen gas, O2. And the thing about that is they figured out that that would be a chain reaction, a runaway chain reaction that would start eating up the Earth's stratospheric ozone layer. And that's big news because that's our sort of global sunscreen. And when we don't have it, we have more skin cancer, more ocular cataracts, more immune dysfunction. So they won the Nobel Prize in 1995 for this work. This was published in 1974. And they shared that Nobel Prize with Paul Crutzen, who was looking at nitrous oxide as an ozone depleting substance and also as later on as a greenhouse gas. So this work, you know, when my colleagues Rowland and Molina were publishing this in '74, they were viewed as quacks. Our chancellor was getting calls from people in industry saying, fire these guys, they're nuts, you know, they're going to kill our CFC business. And the National Academy of Sciences decided to do a review, and they started looking at the calculations that Molina and Rowland had, and they figured out that these guys were on target, they were on track. And this was one of the precursors of the Environmental Protection Agency forming when they figured out that this was going on. And in 1984, this big hole in the ozone layer over Antarctica was discovered. People were putting up balloons and tracking what was in the air, and they found this depletion of ozone. So it really got people's attention. And one of the most effective environmental treaties ever enacted was the Montreal Protocol, because it has actually started to heal the Earth's ozone layer because of the banning of ozone depleting substances. Of course, there's still many of them being produced illegally, and they get up in the stratosphere anyway, but this treaty has had a huge positive impact on that wicked problem, starting to heal the ozone layer. But another wicked problem was signaled by this man's work. Anyone heard of Charles Keeling? Okay, so you know about the Keeling curve. He went to Hawaii and he set up this monitoring station to track how much carbon dioxide was in the air. And he looked at between 1958 and 1972, and he saw this sort of undulating pattern where in the summer you have a lot more foliage, so that sinks more carbon dioxide into the plants, and then in the winter you have more of that escaping the atmosphere. So you have this up and down pattern, but basically there's a linear trend. And when he was doing that work, it was around 327 parts per million in the atmosphere. And this is a look in May 16th, 2018. You can go to the Keeling Curve website, and they give you weekly reports on CO2, and it's not just in Hawaii. They have monitoring stations all over the world. And this data here, going back 800,000 years, is based on ice core data, where you look at CO2 bubbles in the ice, and they can, from that, gauge how much CO2 was in the atmosphere. This spike over here is when Keeling started to do his work to the present. So you can see that's a very tiny slice of time. But now we're up to 412 parts per million, and you've seen the latest climate reports come out and the dire predictions if we don't start to slow that. So, you know, when people try to date, when did the Anthropocene start? One of the best candidates for that is what's called the Great Acceleration, 1950 onwards, after World War II. Population growth surged, GDP growth in many countries, fertilizer consumption, dam construction, transportation systems, telecommunications. All good, you know, people were risen out of poverty for that. Millions of people alleviated from poverty. But the aftermath of that great acceleration is all of this stuff, the carbon dioxide upsurge, you know, the greenhouse gases, the ozone depleting gases, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone depletion, warming temperatures of the ocean as well as on land, ocean acidification. So you can see this tale of woe in terms of what's come from all of our economic zooming, the great acceleration. So that's one of the time periods in which people say this is where we've entered a new geological phase from the Holocene, which was relatively calm the last 12,000 years, to this Anthropocene. So the starting date being kind of around 1950. So we're stuck now with this global climate change, the rising greenhouse gases, earth temperatures, melting of polar ice caps, sea rise, flooding, climate refugees, disruption of ocean currents like the Gulf Stream, extreme weather events, acidification, deoxygenation of the oceans, and as well as our atmosphere, biodiversity loss, food insecurity, disease pandemics, poverty and income inequality, which is exacerbated by climate change, and regional and international conflicts over scarce resources. So this is what we got to cope with from climate change. And as an ecologist and a social ecologist, you know, one of the things I wonder about is how can we kind of gain a coherent, holistic approach to this that has some traction and has some positive impact. We know, for example, that not everybody is feeling climate change the same, right? There's some groups that are much more sensitive. So there are people that are geographically sensitive. They live in island areas, or they live in deltas that are susceptible to flooding, or they live in desert areas. And then there are socio-demographic factors that make people more susceptible to climate change. Poverty, especially women and children in poverty, the elderly, the infirm. So it's not as if everybody's seeing it. It's hard to get people's attention when they're affluent and they don't see climate change because they're living in a higher elevation, or they're living in a not so sensitive geographic region. So in this book that I mentioned earlier, I began to develop some general principles on, as an ecologist, how would we first understand the structure of environments and the joint impact of their different dimensions on us. So one core principle is that, and I say that these core principles kind of cut across, and they're rooted in biological ecology, but they've been sort of elaborated as you go through human and social ecology. But we have these multiple dimensions in our environments: the natural environment, the built, the sociocultural, and now the virtual or cyber-based, some of which are perceived. So when Shel Cohen did that research on the colds, you know, who gets colds, perceived psychological stress is a very important moderator. So it's not just the observable environment. And so if you look at this as a human community, as a kind of composite of the built and the natural and the cyber, you can look at these different planes or these different arenas of environmental influence on our day-to-day health, behavior, and sustainability outcomes. And I've tended to concentrate a lot on the cybersphere because we don't often think of it as a big impact on climate change or on other facets of our lives. We think of it as just sort of immaterial flows of energy, no big deal. But I want to show some examples of where it makes a difference. This is an example of a village in China where they have grown and developed this big quick read code so that people flying over the village can take a picture of that, scan it, and learn about opportunities to visit that community, tourism, ecotourism. So you've got here the natural environment, the cyber in this code. You've got the built environment, the social environment of tourism, all fused into one. So they're highly interconnected. And the cybersphere, as I deal with it in the book, is very broad. I'm not just talking about social media. I'm not just talking about the internet, but I'm talking about the cybersphere writ large, because it's a huge web of influence on us. From the web, the deep web, and the dark web, cryptocurrencies, blockchain, Bitcoin. This Bitcoin itself is almost up to 1% of the Earth's energy budget in terms of what it consumes for hash calculations. So these technologies are very impactful in terms of greenhouse gases. mobile phones, other devices that send and receive messages, Wi-Fi technologies, web browsers, social search engines, social media, apps, all of these things, virtual communities that we get involved in, the sharing economy, Uber, Airbnb, Internet of Things, where we have millions of devices that are communicating with each other, streaming data to each other without any human intervention, and that uses a lot of energy as well. Augmented virtual reality, GPS navigation, autonomous vehicles, smart cities. So this is the cybersphere sort of broken out. And one of the things we don't have are ways of understanding people's interactions with the cybersphere. So I focused a lot on these new units of analysis. This is my home growing up in Miami. This is my elementary school. And these are two real environments in my activity pattern. I used to bike back and forth. If you look at this environment, this is a real environment, the airplane, connected to a virtual environment. You know, maybe she's checking email, or she's on eBay or what have you, using the Wi-Fi of the airplane. And so you've got a real virtual linkage versus just real. And that's significant because it means that, you know, we typically access cyber virtual environments and settings from some real place. You're in this room, you might have a computer, you're looking online. And so you have these real virtual linkages. You have a child might be looking at Instagram or Facebook from their bedroom, or a parent who's working on their blog site, or Facebook or LinkedIn from their office. And you know, sometimes those are going on right next to each other, one room and another room, but they don't even know, they're not part of the same linkage there. And another thing I talk about is that there's a near cybersphere, which are all those cyberspaces I was just talking about that we access from a place. And they can be positively related, neutrally related, or negative. And what I mean by that is, if I'm an employee here and my supervisor wants me to be working on some task, and I'm surfing the web recreationally, looking at Facebook, and they come by and say, "What are you doing? You're not doing your work." That's a kind of negative impact where the two environments aren't supporting each other. On the other hand, if I'm in that's over here, this negative, if I'm over here in a lecture hall and I'm teaching a class and I'm pulling in resources that reinforce my lecture content, then that's a kind of complementary relationship between the real and the virtual. And these are just the settings we're aware of psychologically, but then when you throw in the distant cybersphere, which are these global positioning satellites that are orbiting the Earth, all those signals, the dark web, where a lot of nefarious stuff goes on, the Internet of Things, we don't even see that. We're not aware of it, but those things have the capacity to impact our well-being in major ways. They can bring an electrical grid down through cyber hacking. There's you know, child trafficking that goes on in those sites. So being aware of this more distant cybersphere is a very important part of our ecology now. We have to kind of dial that in along with, you know, the settings that we typically go to for social media or the internet. Now, one of the things that I have been interested in is the linkages, the interfaces between these different facets of our ecological environments. You know, the built social, the built natural, the natural sociocultural, cyber sociocultural, cyber built, cyber natural. So a built natural example, this is a study from Berkeley by Don Appleyard looking at the effects of automobile volume, traffic volume in a community, and neighboring, a social outcome. So you've got a physical interface with a social outcome. And they find that when you have about 2,000 vehicles going through that neighborhood a day, that street, and these are all streets in the same neighborhood, so they're pretty similar people living there. When you go up to 16,000 cars a day and you ask people to describe their home neighborhood or their home territory, the people in the low traffic volume block view the whole block as their territory, their neighborhood. Whereas you have more and more of that physical flow of cars going through, people kind of retract into their immediate apartments, and you have less of that neighboring, less of that social capital in the neighborhood. So that's a physical social interface. You know, there are many interfaces that happen with the cyber. The cyber is changing the design of our physical environments, our built environments, from smart cities to autonomous vehicles. It's having all kinds of social impacts on, you know, worries about the security of voting machines, online dating, the post-truth era. Can we trust our information ecology anymore? Because there's so much, you know, robotic messaging going on out there. We don't even know what's true sometimes. Proliferation of cybercrime, cyber vulnerabilities of food and water infrastructures, transportation, electrical grids. So there's clearly that interface between the cyber and the social. And then when I talked about energy use in the cyber, some projections are that cyber technologies could account for as much as 51% of global energy use by the year 2030, and for close to 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's a lot. So when we ignore the cybersphere as part of our ecology, we do that at our peril, because it actually accounts for a huge amount of energy and CO2 emissions. And so that's something we have to pay attention to. When I walk by the beach here in Crystal Cove near my home in Irvine, it's about a 20-minute drive, I don't see ocean acidification. I don't see the fact that phytoplankton are dying off because of the lack of oxygen and acidification. And in fact, phytoplankton generate half of the oxygen on Earth through photosynthesis. And then they trap carbon, they sink to the bottom of the ocean. They're wonderful, but they're dying off. They're part of the base species of the food chain in oceans. We don't see that. You know, walking by, everything looks fine. I don't see these swirling patches of trash that are swirling around in the Pacific, nor do I see the radiation that's going into the water at Fukushima, and it's being carried by bluefin tuna from the western to the eastern Pacific. You don't see all of that, but it's happening there beneath the radar. So another principle of social ecology is that our transactions with our environments are bounded within these, nested within these interlocking structures that go from our immediate environments out to more macro scales. And if we're going to tackle something like sustainability, then we've really got to pay attention to all of these levels. We can't just work at the multilateral treaty level, like the Paris Climate Accord, or through national or municipal policies, or what workplace managers decide in terms of solar use in the workplace, or residential owners decide, or even these individuals, whether they behave sustainably or not. We've got to link these levels from the on-the-ground individual people who we want to embrace more of a sustainable lifestyle to these other more macro strategies. So we have a government now that has pulled out of the Climate Accord. Now, one of the treaties that's very important that a lot of countries have signed on to are the Sustainability Development Goals. But the Paris Climate Accord is another major one. Our government pulled out of it in June 17. So now the states and the mayors are teaming up to honor those agreements and try to work toward the Paris climate target goals. And the private sector is picking up a lot of the slack. So we're seeing huge strides in these renewable energy technologies. And for the first time in 2015, renewable energy overtook coal as the world's largest installed power source, driven largely by the growth of solar, wind, and water power. So, you know, it's not all lost that we're not right now contributing as much as we should at the 30,000 foot level with the Paris Climate Accord, because at least some of these other levels are compensating. And we need that to happen. We need these plastic ban policies, the curbside recycling. We need the law that California just instituted that all future residential development must have solar technology built into it. That's a huge impact on the environment, because we're talking 40 million plus people. Urban planning is a huge influence on whether people adopt sustainable lifestyles, whether they resort to biking and non-motorized transit, they use trains, trams. This is Zurich and many cities. You know, you contrast that with LA, where we're so car dependent. So how you design your environment has a big impact on whether people will behave sustainably. Another strategy is to link these large-scale civil infrastructures, the water, the energy, and the agricultural sectors, with what would be called local sustainable technologies, residential solar, urban farming, and home water capture. And the more we can get people in these more local behavior settings to adopt these technologies, it makes the whole system more resilient, because you have more reserve capacity in terms of those resources. And then, of course, we've got to think about how to educate people to have them appreciate sustainability values. Environmental stewardship programs like this one, the City Repair Project in Portland, Oregon. This is an interesting book on that issue by Daniel Goleman, getting people to adopt solar energy batteries and electric cars. At UCI, we have a big investment in renewables and solar energy and these buses that ride around the campus that are all electric. So these are some of the things I wanted to mention too, that if you're interested in any of the research I covered today, my environmental psych course is online at iTunes. It's also online in a server in China with Mandarin translations if anyone's interested in that. And you can pick up on some of that information there. So I'm going to close with that. I appreciate your attention. I covered a lot here, and so I hope I didn't, present too much information at you, but I'm open to any questions you might have or discussion. Thank you. Yeah.
Are these slides available anywhere?
I'll make them available to Noah, sure. Yeah, and you can see the links on them. Many of them have links to where yeah.
So in terms of society in general, right, so you can sort of look and say, okay, well, how are we going to solve our energy crisis here? Well, at one level you can say, okay, we can be socialist and say, okay, well, let's go to renewables because that's good for everyone, that's good for society. Or you can be capitalistic and say, well, there's going to be a lot of money to be made.
Right.
So do you view, in terms of dealing with these problems, as an approach that's more socialist, capitalist, or some sort of mixture?
It's a blend. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that renewables are economically in our best interest, long range, as well as our health interest. But I also think that we sometimes need regulations, because as we peel back these regulations, when I came to Irvine in the early 70s, smog was incredible in Southern California. And because we had a lot of anti-smog regulations and changes in gasoline content and all of that, we saw a real improvement in air quality. It's not totally fixed, but that saved, and there have been studies of what that saved in terms of hospitalizations due to asthma, respiratory problems, premature death. And when we start to roll back these protections of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, I mean, a lot of, our administration says we have the best air quality and water quality in the world. That's not true. Many of our communities have very poor water quality. It's not just Flint, Michigan, but many of the communities have problems. So it seems to me the role of government should be to step in and protect the public health when there's so much evidence that climate change is happening. We need a cleaner environment, and I think sometimes the market doesn't, there's no mechanism for the market to do that explicitly, or it's a very slow mechanism if it happens. So I worry about all the regulations that have been taken away by the current administration.
Yeah, I heard you use the word regulations several times and protections once. And it reminds me of how bereft our language is in its capability to get people, regular Joe Bag of Donuts kind of people, to understand how critical our environmental problems are. And it makes me think that we've just got to come up with a way to communicate that issue. And for instance, get rid of the word regulations and call them protections, because that's what they are. But regulations is a word used as a pejorative.
Yes.
To get people to be
it's been, that's a great point, and the word has been made pejorative by ideological considerations, and the issue is the principles of ecology, the value of diversity in ecosystems, and the interlocking fates of these different species, and the value of looking at things as a system over long periods of times at multiple scales. Those are rooted in science, and they're rooted in fact. They're not ideological questions whether climate change is happening or not, but they've been made ideological, and you're probably right. I shouldn't say regulations so much, I just say protections. But we have this political ecology that is encompassing the science we're trying to do, and we have to take account of that political ecology because it has a real bearing on the extent to which we can disseminate this information and get it paid attention to.
But maybe craft language in conjunction with your the science that people need to understand. Craft language that people can really glom onto.
Yeah, that's a very good point, especially in our polarized society where people are just looking for little cues to latch onto to say, oh, that's bad, I don't agree with that.
Very much related to something you mentioned a lot is this whole sort of cyber, whatever we call it, cyber world. And it's one thing to say, how do we communicate our science? How do we communicate things that we feel are true? It's another thing, especially right now, to say, what are strategies for convincing people that they should believe it? Right? I mean, we have an administration that has made a whole cottage industry out of tearing down the institutions that we've always taken as conveying the truth. And you alluded to that a few times in some of your many slides. Can you talk a little bit more about that and about where you see that going? Because if we don't know who to trust, and if I mean, maybe the most important thing we can do as ecologists and as academics is to figure out the right way to build, to build trust and to build constructs that allow people to understand where they should go to believe stuff.
Yes, I think it's right on. I think there are a number of people trying to tackle that problem. There's a science communications field, National Academies has supported this quite a bit, where that's one of the concerns. How do you communicate science in ways that people will pay attention to it and accept it rather than reject it?
How do you communicate the news in
Yeah.
a way where people can clearly distinguish between what is truly fake news, or at least and what we think is real news? And that's very different than science communication.
True, and that's a tough problem. I mean, some websites are trying to put little identifiers. The source of this story is this group, and they are very reputable, or they're not. I think our social media companies, big tech, are struggling with this because they've kind of gotten themselves into a thicket where they don't know how to get out of it. And yeah, it's kind of an echo chamber now with the news, where people are going to watch Fox or they're going to watch MSNBC, and it's rare that people are kind of trying to get their hands around the whole messaging system. So I don't know how you deal with it. I think there are psychologists and psycholinguists who are tackling that. It's not an area of expertise that I have, but it's a point well taken. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions? Yeah.
So I was struck with the first half of your talk about the health benefits and the supposed connections to nature, and I was struck because in a few weeks I'm going to Mumbai in India, where I have a lot of family who constantly talk about kind of yearning for greenery because it's such an urban area with lots of garbage everywhere and a lot of smog. And so what I've been wondering through this conversation is that people's lives, even in the U.S., are being quite affected by these wildfires and hurricanes that are getting worse. And so,
by being affected by what?
By the wildfires and hurricanes that are happening so often. And so I'm kind of wondering, in response to this conversation, how much role is just people's lived experiences going to play in how people prioritize addressing these problems?
Well, I think that's part of why there are affluent groups in different societies that don't think too much about these problems, because they don't see them in their day-to-day lives. They're kind of insulated from them in terms of where they live. They kind of assume they can escape climate change, and so a lot of people will be impacted and they'll bear the brunt, and if they have enough income and they have enough power, they'll be okay. And it's really short-sighted because things are so interconnected. And the fact that there are 3 billion people living in poverty, that's going to catch up with some of those pockets of affluence. They can't ignore that indefinitely. So yeah, I think lived experience plays an important part in terms of what people are sensitive to, what causes they get involved with. But we do have a huge problem in terms of loss of nature, because as you said, fires and coastal flooding are going to subtract a lot of the natural, wildlands and also recreational areas that we go to, whether it's a beach or some other area, because of these climate change impacts. And they're not going to turn around anytime soon. I mean, the best we can do is start getting different countries as well as governors and mayors to really adhere to more embrace of renewable energy, realizing that we have a problem that needs to be stemmed. But you have such a divergence of attitudes on it. It's a huge conundrum right now. To get different countries around the world to pay attention to this where they have leaders or governments that don't think it's that important. There's something like 195, close to 195 signatories on the United Nations Paris Climate Agreement, and it went into effect November 2016. It was signed, enacted, but the U.S. is out of it, and that's I think officially it's out in 2020 if it doesn't get back in. But in the meantime, there are a lot of compensatory strategies that are being implemented to try to keep the momentum toward renewables.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.